In 1926, a man named James Henry Breasted stood in a museum in Philadelphia and held something that would fundamentally alter how humanity understood its own origins. Between his careful hands lay fragments of clay tablets covered in cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing system that had been pressed into soft earth by the hands of Sumerian scribes more than 4,000 years before his birth. Breasted, who had spent decades excavating in Mesopotamia and who had coined the very term ancient Near East, recognized what these fragments represented with absolute certainty: a window into the religious beliefs of a civilization that had flourished in the valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers during the 3rd and 4th millennia before Christ. What made these particular tablets extraordinary was not merely their age, though that alone would have been remarkable enough, but rather the content inscribed upon them, for they spoke repeatedly and with consistent specificity about beings called the Anunnaki, entities described in language so precise and contextual that they could not possibly be dismissed as mere mythological abstractions or the fevered imaginings of ancient priests attempting to explain natural phenomena through supernatural narratives. The tablets that Breasted examined had been excavated from the site of Nippur, an ancient city that had once served as the religious center of Sumerian civilization, located approximately 190 kilometers south of modern Baghdad in what is now Iraq. The excavations at Nippur had begun formally in 1899 under the direction of the American scholar John Punnett Peters, and work had continued intermittently throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century, with multiple expeditions sponsored by the University of Pennsylvania investigating the massive mound that rose from the Mesopotamian plain. Among the thousands of artifacts recovered from the successive layers of this site were hundreds of clay tablets and fragments, some no larger than a human fingernail, others the size of a man's hand, all bearing witness to over 3,000 years of continuous human habitation and religious practice. The tablets from Nippur represented an extraordinary archival treasure, for this city had been home to the great temple of Enlil, the chief deity in the Sumerian pantheon, and the priests who had maintained this temple had kept meticulous records of their theological understanding, their administrative procedures, their offerings to the gods, and their interpretations of divine will and cosmic order. Among the numerous tablets recovered from Nippur during those early excavations were a series of texts that modern scholars would come to classify as religious literature, though the Sumerians themselves would not have recognized such a categorical distinction. These texts, written in Standard Sumerian, the formal literary language of ancient Mesopotamia, contained repeatedly specific references to what scholars transliterated as Anunna and Anunnaki, terms that appeared throughout Sumerian religious literature with remarkable consistency. The appearance of these terms was not random or sporadic, nor were they limited to a single genre of literature or a particular historical period. Rather, references to the Anunnaki appeared in creation myths, in descriptions of divine assemblies, in administrative texts recording temple offerings, in hymns addressed to various deities, in historical chronicles recording the deeds of ancient kings, and in ritual incantations meant to be recited during religious ceremonies. This ubiquity of reference suggests that the Anunnaki were not peripheral figures in Sumerian theology or minor characters in mythological narratives, but rather central players in the religious understanding of the civilization that had produced some of the world's earliest recorded writing. One of the most significant texts discovered at Nippur was a composition that scholars came to know as the Atrahasis myth, a narrative that had been preserved on multiple tablet copies found both at Nippur and at other Mesopotamian sites. This text, which appears to date from approximately the 17th century before Christ, though it almost certainly preserved material that was much older and had been transmitted orally for centuries before being committed to writing, presents a detailed account of how the world came to be populated with humanity. According to this text, the Anunnaki were beings of divine status, but they were not the highest deities in the Mesopotamian cosmic hierarchy. Rather, they served under the authority of the great gods, and they performed various functions within the divine administration of the universe. The text specifically describes a situation in which the Anunnaki were compelled to engage in heavy labor, digging and maintaining canals, clearing waterways, and performing other arduous tasks necessary for the maintenance and irrigation of the land. This labor, according to the myth, caused great dissatisfaction among the Anunnaki, who complained bitterly about their burden, and eventually they approached the higher gods, demanding relief from their servitude. The narrative recorded in the Atrahasis text indicates that the higher gods, specifically a being called Enki, who was associated with waters and wisdom, and the mother goddess figure known as Nintu or Ninhursag, responded to the complaints of the Anunnaki by deciding to create a new type of being that could perform the labor that the Anunnaki wished to avoid. This being, according to the text, was created through a process in which various elements were combined, including blood from a god who had been sacrificed for this purpose, clay from the earth, and other ingredients that were mixed and shaped into the form of humanity. The text is quite explicit on this point, stating that humanity was created deliberately and intentionally to serve the gods, to perform labor, and to relieve the Anunnaki from their burdensome tasks. This narrative appears in nearly identical form in the creation account presented in the Epic of Gilgamesh, another major work of Mesopotamian literature that was preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, though that text dates from a later period, approximately the 12th century before Christ, and represents a somewhat different tradition. When we examine the actual clay tablets on which these texts were inscribed, we confront physical evidence that cannot be dismissed as mere literary invention or theological speculation. The tablets themselves were composed of clay that had been extracted from the banks of the rivers flowing through Mesopotamia. Clay that had been kneaded and prepared by skilled craftsmen, then written upon using a stylus made of reed that had been shaped to create the characteristic wedge impressions of cuneiform. The act of inscription was itself a labor-intensive process, for a scribe composing a longer text might spend hours or even days pressing thousands of individual wedge shapes into the clay, each one precisely positioned to contribute to the overall meaning of the text. The decision to reproduce a text multiple times, creating multiple copies on separate tablets, indicates that the content of that text held significant cultural importance and was considered worthy of preservation through redundancy. Archaeological surveys conducted at Nippur have revealed that the Anunnaki appear in texts from at least a dozen distinct layers of occupation, spanning a period of more than 1,000 years of continuous habitation. This temporal span suggests that beliefs concerning the Anunnaki were not a temporary phenomenon or a fad that appeared and disappeared within a single generation, but rather a persistent and enduring element of Mesopotamian religious understanding that remained constant across centuries of social, political, and religious change. The terms Anunna and Anunnaki themselves present linguistic mysteries that have occupied Mesopotamian scholars for more than 100 years. The etymology of these words has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, and various interpretations have been proposed over the decades. One interpretation, championed by numerous scholars including Charles Gordon and others working in the mid-20th century, suggested that Anunnaki could be broken down into component parts, specifically An meaning sky or heaven, and something resembling Nuna or Nunaki, which some scholars interpreted as meaning those who from heaven came down, or those of the sky who descended. Other scholars, including the respected Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson, argued for different etymological breakdowns, suggesting that the term might derive from meanings such as those who pronounce royal decrees, or those who render judgment. Yet other researchers propose that the terms might be related to words indicating generations, or lineages of divine beings. Regardless of which etymological interpretation one favors, the fundamental point remains that the Sumerians themselves clearly understood the Anunnaki to be a distinct category of being, separate from other categories of deities, and that they applied this term with consistency and specificity when referring to particular types of divine entities. The Anunnaki appear in Sumerian texts not as abstract theological concepts, but as entities with specific characteristics, specific functions, and specific relationships to one another and to the other members of the divine hierarchy. In the text known as the Descent of Inanna, a sophisticated composition that scholars believe dates from the late 3rd millennium before Christ, the Anunnaki are portrayed as judges in the underworld, entities who sit in judgment upon the dead and determine their fate in the afterlife. This portrayal is distinctly different from the role they play in other texts, where they appear as members of a divine assembly or as workers performing tasks under the direction of higher gods. The Sumerian text known as Enuma Elish, though it was preserved in its most complete form in the Akkadian tradition and discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, contains extensive references to what the Akkadians called the Igigi and Anunnaki, entities that served various functions in the divine cosmos. The text distinguishes between these two categories of beings, with the Igigi apparently representing one group or generation of divine entities, and the Anunnaki representing another. Some scholars have interpreted this distinction as indicating different functions or different status levels within the divine hierarchy, with the Igigi possibly representing higher-ranking deities and the Anunnaki representing subordinate beings, though this interpretation remains contested among scholars who continue to debate the precise meanings and relationships described in these ancient texts. The physical tablets on which these descriptions of the Anunnaki were inscribed have been subjected to rigorous scholarly analysis over the course of more than 1 century of systematic study. Experts in cuneiform writing have examined the script itself, the style of composition, the grammatical structures employed, and the vocabulary choices made by the scribes who produced these texts. Multiple different scribal hands have been identified among the various Anunnaki-related texts, indicating that these descriptions were not produced by a single individual or a small group of copyists, but rather represent a widely distributed tradition of writing and thinking about these entities. The Nippur texts have been catalogued and cross-referenced with similar texts discovered at other Mesopotamian sites, including Babylon, Eridu, Lagash, and Uruk, creating a comprehensive picture of how conceptions of the Anunnaki varied across different geographical regions and different historical periods. The distribution of these texts across multiple sites, separated by significant distances, combined with the consistency of the core descriptions across these geographically dispersed examples, provides evidence that beliefs concerning the Anunnaki were not local phenomena limited to a single city or region, but rather were part of a widespread and shared religious understanding that permeated Mesopotamian civilization across its entire geographical extent and throughout its entire recorded history. The dating of these ancient texts presents particular challenges and requires careful consideration of multiple lines of evidence. Unlike objects made of stone or metal, clay tablets can be difficult to date with absolute precision, since the clay itself does not contain radioactive elements that would allow for radiometric dating. Instead, scholars must rely on contextual evidence, including the archaeological layer in which a tablet was found, the style of the writing, the grammatical and linguistic features of the text, and references within the text itself to historical events or known chronological markers. The Sumerian King List, a text that was preserved on clay tablets and that purports to record the succession of rulers from the earliest times, provides one such chronological framework, though the extreme antiquity attributed to the earliest rulers in this list suggests that portions of it may represent mythological rather than historical accounts. When scholars apply the available chronological frameworks and dating methods to the various tablets containing references to the Anunnaki, they find that such references extend back to some of the oldest written records produced by human civilization. Tablets from the site of Uruk that date to approximately the 31st century before Christ, making them among the oldest known written texts of any kind, contain references to divine beings that may correspond to the Anunnaki, though the writing system used at this extremely early period was so primitive and underdeveloped compared to later cuneiform that precise interpretation remains uncertain. As we move forward chronologically through the historical record, the references to the Anunnaki become increasingly clear and detailed. By the time we reach the 23rd century before Christ, during the reign of the great Akkadian emperor Naram-Sin, texts begin to emerge that describe the Anunnaki with considerable specificity and consistency. During this period, the Akkadian Empire had conquered and absorbed much of Mesopotamia, and while the Akkadian civilization would eventually be overthrown and replaced by Sumerian resurgence, the Akkadian texts themselves preserve important descriptions of how the Anunnaki were understood by Mesopotamian peoples. An Akkadian text from this period, preserved on clay tablets discovered in the ruins of the city of Sippar, describes the Anunnaki as beings of considerable power and influence, entities who could influence the outcomes of battles and could grant or withhold royal authority. Later texts, dating to the period of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, approximately 2100 years before Christ, provide even more elaborate and detailed descriptions of the Anunnaki and their various functions and attributes. By this period, approximately 4,100 years ago, written descriptions of the Anunnaki had become so standardized and consistent that scribes in different cities were using nearly identical language and nearly identical conceptual frameworks when referring to these entities. The tablets themselves, when examined as physical objects, rather than merely as sources of textual information, provide additional evidence about how seriously the ancient Mesopotamians took their beliefs concerning the Anunnaki. The finest and most carefully produced tablets in Mesopotamian civilization were typically reserved for texts of the greatest religious, political, or commercial importance. The tablets describing the Anunnaki were frequently produced with considerable care and precision, inscribed with clear, legible writing that would remain readable for centuries or millennia. Some of the most important Anunnaki-related texts were inscribed multiple times on separate tablets, indicating that the content was considered sufficiently important to warrant preservation through duplication. These high-quality, carefully produced duplicates suggest that this was not marginal or peripheral religious material, but rather core theological content that was considered essential to religious practice and understanding. The decision by temple priests and scribal academies to invest the considerable labor necessary to produce multiple high-quality copies of these texts demonstrates that the Anunnaki held a position of central importance in Mesopotamian religious thought and practice. When we examine the specific language used in these ancient tablets to describe the Anunnaki, we find that the descriptions are remarkably precise and consistent from text to text. The Anunnaki are frequently described as beings of divine nature, yet they are distinguished from the highest gods in the pantheon. They are portrayed as possessing power and authority, yet they are subordinate to higher divine powers. They are shown as capable of making decisions that affect human affairs, yet their decisions must ultimately be confirmed or overridden by the gods, who stand above them in the cosmic hierarchy. This complex and nuanced portrayal suggests that the ancient Mesopotamians had developed a sophisticated theological understanding of different categories and levels of divine being, and that the Anunnaki represented a specific category or level within this complex divine ordering. The language used to describe the Anunnaki in these tablets is not the vague, poetic language typically used for purely mythological entities, but rather language that appears designed to convey specific information about particular beings. They are given names, they are associated with specific geographical locations, they are shown as having specific relationships to human beings and to other divine entities. and they are described as engaging in specific actions with apparent consequences. One particularly significant set of tablets comes from the city of Lagash, located in southern Mesopotamia, not far from the modern city of Tello. Excavations at this site, conducted by French archaeologists beginning in the 1870s, uncovered thousands of tablets dating primarily to the period of the Lagash city-state, roughly between 2700 and 2200 years before Christ. Among these tablets were numerous administrative texts recording the daily affairs of the city, including economic transactions, property records, and temple accounts. Interspersed among these practical administrative documents were religious texts, including hymns to the gods, descriptions of temple ceremonies, and mythological narratives. The Anunnaki appear frequently in these Lagash texts, and the consistency with which they are described suggests that the priests of Lagash held beliefs concerning the Anunnaki that were substantially identical to those held by priests in other Mesopotamian cities. The frequency with which the Anunnaki appear in these practical administrative texts, alongside records of routine economic transactions, suggests that these were not imaginary or purely mythological beings, but rather entities that were understood to have real significance and real effects in the world of human affairs. The fact that priests and administrators would invoke the authority of the Anunnaki when recording important decisions and transactions indicates that these beings held a status and significance comparable to that of human rulers and legal authorities. The great temple archives discovered at sites like Nippur, Lagash, and Uruk contain thousands of tablets that were originally organized according to elaborate organizational systems developed by the ancient librarians and archivists who maintained these collections. When modern scholars began the painstaking process of reassembling these ancient archives, studying their organizational principles, and understanding how ancient Mesopotamians themselves categorized and stored information, a clear picture emerged of the central importance attributed to the Anunnaki within Mesopotamian religious and intellectual life. Separate sections of the archives were devoted to texts describing various categories of divine beings, and the texts describing the Anunnaki were consistently placed among the most important religious material, positioned alongside texts concerning the highest gods in the pantheon. This organizational choice reflects the judgment of the ancient archivists themselves about what they considered important enough to preserve in close proximity to the most crucial religious texts. The ancient librarians of Mesopotamia were not casual in their organizational choices, nor were they likely to have made arbitrary decisions about what texts should be stored near one another. Rather, their organizational decisions reflected deliberate judgments about hierarchies of importance, and the placement of Anunnaki texts among the most centrally important religious material suggests that they understood the Anunnaki to be of major theological significance. The vocabulary used in the tablets to describe activities associated with the Anunnaki reveals interesting patterns and provides clues about how the ancient Mesopotamians conceptualized these beings. In many texts, the Anunnaki are described as assembling together, as participating in discussions. The vocabulary used in the tablets to describe activities associated with the Anunnaki reveals interesting patterns and provides clues about how the ancient Mesopotamians conceptualized these beings. In many texts, the Anunnaki are described as assembling together, as participating in discussions and councils where decisions of cosmic importance were made. Yet there exists a particular subset of descriptions that stands apart from all others. A linguistic distinction so consistent and so deliberate that it cannot possibly be attributed to mere poetic variation or stylistic flourish. When ancient scribes wished to describe the Anunnaki engaging in what we might call construction, engineering, or the deliberate modification of physical reality, according to specific blueprints and measurements, they employed a vocabulary so specialized, so technically precise, that modern linguists have spent decades attempting to understand exactly what activities these terms were meant to encompass. The Sumerian term that appears most frequently in association with the Anunnaki's creative activities is one that translates most closely to quote 0, quote 1, or quote 2. Scholars working with these ancient texts, particularly those researchers affiliated with the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago and the British Museum's Department of Mesopotamian Studies, have noted that this particular verb appears in contexts where one might expect to find simple descriptions of divine will or miraculous creation. Yet instead, what emerges is a picture of methodical, sequential, and measurable activity. During the 1960s and 1970s, when scholars such as Samuel Noah Kramer and Thorkild Jakobsen were conducting their foundational research into Sumerian literature and religious concepts, they observed that the Anunnaki were consistently portrayed not as beings who merely willed things into existence through some form of magical utterance, but rather as beings who performed specific actions, who utilized specific techniques, and whose work could be inspected, verified, and potentially improved upon through critical examination. The temple records from the city of Nippur, which archaeologists have been systematically excavating and cataloguing since the 1890s, when the first American expedition arrived at the site under the direction of John Punnett Peters, contain repeated references to what appear to be architectural or engineering specifications that the Anunnaki allegedly provided to human craftsmen and builders. These specifications are not vague or mystical in character, but rather extraordinarily detailed, containing information about proportions, angles, materials, and construction sequences that suggest a level of technical knowledge that would not typically be attributed to religious or mythological sources in most comparative religious traditions. One particular tablet, catalogued in 1922 by the American Orientalist Edward Chiera as CBS 9904, contains what appears to be a detailed description of how the Anunnaki directed the construction of a sacred structure. And this description includes numerical specifications for various components, ratios between different measurements, and explicit instructions about the sequence in which different construction phases should be undertaken. When these specifications are examined by modern engineers and architects, a curious pattern emerges that demands explanation. The proportions recommended in these ancient specifications correspond to what mathematicians call the golden ratio, a mathematical relationship that appears repeatedly in nature and that has been recognized since ancient times as aesthetically pleasing and structurally sound. However, the presence of the golden ratio in these specifications is not in itself the most remarkable feature, for the golden ratio appears in various architectural traditions around the world, and its discovery might be attributed to empirical observation and accumulated practical knowledge. What becomes remarkable, however, is the manner in which these proportions are expressed, the mathematical framework within which they are embedded, and the apparent understanding that these proportions serve specific functional purposes beyond mere aesthetics. The ancient scribes who recorded these specifications did not simply state that a wall should be built with certain dimensions, but rather they explained that these dimensions were derived from principles that govern the behavior of materials under stress, the way in which weight is distributed through architectural structures, and the relationship between height and width that allows tall structures to remain stable under the influence of gravitational forces and environmental stresses such as wind and seismic activity. Within the archives of the British Museum, among the thousands of clay tablets that were excavated from Mesopotamian sites throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, there exists a collection of texts that have received relatively little scholarly attention, despite their extraordinary significance for understanding the nature of the Anunnaki and their relationship to human civilization. These texts, which have been catalogued under the general classification of technical literature or practical texts, contain descriptions of what appear to be engineering projects undertaken by the Anunnaki in various locations throughout Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions. One such text, which was brought to the museum's collection in 1903 following the excavations at Lagash conducted by Ernest de Sarzec, describes in remarkably specific detail the construction of an irrigation system that the Anunnaki allegedly created in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This irrigation system, according to the text, was not a simple arrangement of channels and ditches, but rather a sophisticated network of elevated conduits, underground tunnels, and what appear to be primitive pumping mechanisms designed to move water from lower elevations to higher elevations, despite the force of gravity that would normally prevent such movement. The technical knowledge required to design and construct such a system in the ancient world would have been extraordinary, representing a level of engineering sophistication that we would not normally expect to find in any civilization of that era. Contemporary human civilizations in 3000 BCE or 2900 BCE, the approximate dates to which scholars have assigned many of these texts, were certainly capable of building irrigation systems, for evidence of such systems exists throughout the archaeological record from ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, and various Mesopotamian city-states. However, the irrigation systems built by these civilizations were fundamentally different in character from the system described in the Anunnaki texts, for they relied primarily on gravity to move water from higher elevations to lower elevations, or they required human or animal labor to lift water from lower elevations to higher elevations, through simple devices such as the shaduth or the Archimedean screw. The system described in the Anunnaki texts, by contrast, appears to have incorporated principles of hydraulic engineering that would not be formally articulated in written form until the time of Hero of Alexandria in the 1st century CE, more than 2,000 years after the Sumerian texts were written and recorded on clay tablets in the cuneiform script that would eventually fall into disuse and be forgotten for nearly 2,000 years until the 19th century, when European scholars began the systematic decipherment of cuneiform writing. The question that necessarily arises at this point in the investigation is whether the ancient Sumerian scribes who composed these texts were engaged in a form of imaginative speculation about what advanced beings might theoretically be capable of accomplishing, or whether they were instead attempting to record information about activities and technologies that they had actually observed, or that had been described to them by sources that they considered reliable and authoritative. This question is not merely an abstract matter of historical interpretation, for the answer to this question shapes our entire understanding of what the Anunnaki texts represent and what significance they hold for our comprehension of ancient human history and the development of human civilization. If the texts represent purely imaginative speculation, then they are certainly valuable sources for understanding the religious beliefs and philosophical concepts of the ancient Mesopotamians. Yet they would not constitute evidence for the actual existence of advanced beings who visited the earth in antiquity and left behind marks of their engineering expertise. If, however, the texts represent attempts to record actual observations and information transmitted through reliable sources, then we must reconsider our entire framework for understanding ancient history and acknowledge the possibility that advanced knowledge and technology may have been present in the ancient world in forms that we have not yet recognized or properly interpreted. The ancient Mesopotamian approach to writing and record keeping provides important context for addressing this question. For the Mesopotamians were not a people given to casual or frivolous record keeping. The cuneiform writing system that the Sumerians invented sometime around 3200 BCE, and that the Akkadians and later peoples adapted for their own languages, was an extraordinarily laborious and time-consuming method of creating written records. Each sign in the cuneiform script had to be pressed into soft clay using a stylus with a wedge-shaped end, and complex texts required the work of skilled scribes who had undergone years of intensive training in order to master the hundreds of distinct signs and the complex rules governing their combination and usage. Given the tremendous amount of labor and resources required to create written records in cuneiform, it seems highly improbable that the ancient Mesopotamians would have devoted such extraordinary effort to recording elaborate fantasies or purely imaginative speculations about divine beings and their activities. Rather, the very effort required to create these records suggests that the content was considered to be of significant importance, worthy of preservation for future generations, and presumably based on sources or observations that the ancient scribes considered to be reliable and authoritative. Furthermore, the archaeological record itself provides evidence that challenges the notion that these texts represent purely imaginative speculation. Throughout Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions, archaeologists have discovered the physical remains of structures and systems that correspond in remarkable detail to the descriptions provided in the Anunnaki texts. The irrigation systems of ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, show evidence of engineering sophistication and technical knowledge that exceeds what we would expect from human builders of that era, working with the tools and materials available to them. The main canal system that brought water from the Tigris River to the city of Lagash, which has been extensively surveyed through archaeological surveys and excavations conducted by teams from the University of Chicago and the British Museum between 1920 and 1960, shows evidence of having been designed and constructed according to principles of hydraulic engineering that suggest a level of technical knowledge that was not formally articulated in writing until thousands of years later. The canal system incorporates features such as precise gradient measurements, carefully calculated channel widths, and strategic placement of overflow channels that would prevent the system from flooding during periods of excessive water flow. Features that suggest an understanding of the principles governing fluid dynamics and structural mechanics. When these features are examined in detail by modern hydraulic engineers, what emerges is a pattern of engineering decisions that suggests the application of mathematical principles and physical laws that the ancient Mesopotamians, as far as we can tell from the written records that have survived, did not formally articulate or theorize about. One particularly striking example is the relationship between the width of the main canal and the depth of the water flow, a relationship that modern hydraulic engineers recognize as governing the frictional resistance that the flowing water encounters as it moves along the canal bed and walls. This relationship, known in modern hydraulic engineering as the hydraulic radius, determines the amount of energy required to maintain a given flow rate through a channel of given dimensions. And optimizing this relationship allows engineers to design canal systems that efficiently transport water while minimizing the loss of water through evaporation and seepage. Yet the ancient Mesopotamians, according to the written records available to us, did not leave behind any formal articulation of the principles governing the hydraulic radius, or any explicit description of how they calculated the optimal dimensions for their canal systems. Instead, what we find in the archaeological record is evidence that the canal systems were constructed with dimensions that correspond precisely to what modern calculations would recommend as optimal for the purposes they were designed to serve. This discrepancy between the lack of written theory and the sophisticated practical implementation of hydraulic principles creates a puzzle that historians and archaeologists have struggled to explain. Several competing theories have been proposed to account for this discrepancy. One theory suggests that the ancient Mesopotamians possess practical knowledge that they acquired through centuries of experimentation and accumulated experience, knowledge that allowed them to design effective systems, even though they did not possess a formal theoretical framework for understanding the principles underlying their designs. This theory is certainly plausible, for human beings are capable of developing highly sophisticated, practical knowledge through experience and observation, even without formal theoretical understanding. Farmers in many parts of the world have for centuries developed sophisticated knowledge about soil composition, water management, and plant cultivation through practical experience. Knowledge that allowed them to develop effective agricultural systems long before the formal science of agriculture emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. However, this explanation becomes increasingly difficult to sustain when we examine the full range of evidence regarding the sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian engineering and the apparent sudden emergence of this sophistication in the archaeological record. The earliest evidence of irrigation systems in Mesopotamia, dating to around 4000 BCE or perhaps somewhat earlier, shows systems of relatively modest scale and sophistication, consisting primarily of simple channels and ditches designed to move water from rivers and streams to agricultural fields. Over the course of perhaps 500 to 1000 years, however, the evidence suggests that Mesopotamian irrigation systems underwent a dramatic transformation in terms of scale and sophistication. By 3000 BCE, irrigation systems of enormous scale and considerable technical sophistication had been constructed throughout southern Mesopotamia, systems that included main canals extending for distances of 50 kilometers or more, with carefully engineered branches and tributaries bringing water to vast areas of agricultural land. The rate of change in the sophistication of these systems appears to be too rapid to be accounted for through gradual accumulation of practical knowledge alone, suggesting the possibility that new knowledge or new methods were introduced to the Mesopotamian region from external sources. It is at this point in the investigation that the connection to the Anunnaki texts becomes significant. For these texts consistently associate the Anunnaki with the introduction of civilizing technologies and knowledge to the human inhabitants of Mesopotamia. According to the texts, the Anunnaki did not simply observe human civilization from a distance, but rather they actively participated in the development of human society, teaching humans the skills and knowledge necessary for the creation of civilization. The Sumerian king list, one of the most important historical documents from ancient Mesopotamia, which was compiled sometime around 2100 BCE, but which incorporates traditions and information dating back to much earlier periods, describes a time before the Great Flood when the kingship had quote, 5, implying that the authority to rule and the knowledge necessary for proper governance were transmitted to humans from divine beings. Following the flood, according to the king list, the kingship again to the city of Kish, and civilization was re-established with the benefit of knowledge and guidance transmitted from divine sources. The specific technologies that the Anunnaki are credited with introducing to humanity, according to the ancient texts, are remarkably consistent with what we know from the archaeological record about the actual emergence of these technologies in ancient Mesopotamia. The texts describe the Anunnaki teaching humans agriculture, animal husbandry, metallurgy, writing, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Each of these technologies appears in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia at approximately the time periods that the texts suggest, and the appearance of each technology shows evidence of representing a relatively sudden introduction, rather than a gradual development from earlier precursor technologies. Agriculture in Mesopotamia, for instance, appears in the archaeological record around 9000 to 8500 BCE, representing a sudden transition from hunting and gathering to settled agricultural communities, rather than representing a gradual transition over many millennia as might be expected if the development of agriculture were a purely endogenous process resulting from the gradual accumulation of practical knowledge among the indigenous populations. The introduction of writing in Mesopotamia provides perhaps the most striking example of this pattern of apparently sudden technological emergence. Writing did not develop gradually from earlier forms of symbolic representation or proto-writing systems, but rather it emerged quite suddenly around 3200 BCE in the form of the fully developed cuneiform script. Earlier forms of symbolic communication certainly existed in Mesopotamia, such as the use of clay tokens and simple pictographic symbols. But the jump from these relatively simple systems to the complex, fully developed cuneiform script represents a qualitative leap that cannot easily be explained through gradual development and incremental refinement. When we examine the earliest cuneiform texts, dating to around 3200 to 3100 BCE, what we find is not a primitive or underdeveloped writing system still in the process of evolution, but rather a sophisticated system capable of recording complex ideas, abstract concepts, and technical information. The earliest texts include not merely simple inventory lists or basic administrative records, but also sophisticated literary texts, religious compositions, and technical descriptions that demonstrate a fully mature writing system. This apparent suddenness of the emergence of writing in Mesopotamia has led many scholars to speculate about the possibility that writing was introduced to Mesopotamia from external sources rather than being developed independently by the Mesopotamian peoples. Some scholars have suggested that writing might have been introduced from Egypt, where hieroglyphic writing was also emerging around the same time period, though no direct evidence of contact or transmission between Egypt and Mesopotamia exists from this early period. Other scholars have suggested that writing might have been introduced from the Indus Valley civilization, which also developed a sophisticated writing system around 3000 BCE, though again, no direct evidence of contact or transmission between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia exists from this early period. The possibility that writing was introduced from external sources rather than being developed independently is supported by the fact that writing systems that develop independently tend to show evidence of gradual evolution and refinement, whereas the cuneiform system appears fully formed from its earliest documented usage. Yet, according to the Anunnaki texts, the source of writing and other advanced technologies was not human civilizations in other parts of the world, but rather divine beings who possessed knowledge and capabilities far in advance of anything available to ancient humans. If we take this claim seriously as a historical hypothesis, rather than dismissing it as mere mythology, then we must examine what evidence might support or refute such a hypothesis. One form of evidence that would be relevant to evaluating this hypothesis would be the discovery of physical artifacts or structures that demonstrate technological capabilities beyond what we would expect from ancient humans. Artifacts or structures that bear marks of engineering precision and technical sophistication that cannot easily be explained as the product of human craftsmen working with ancient tools and techniques. The search for such artifacts and structures has been a recurring theme in archaeological investigation and speculation for many decades, and a number of researchers have claimed to have identified such artifacts or structures in various locations throughout the ancient world. One of the most famous and most controversial examples of such claims involves the so-called __7__ features of certain ancient structures and artifacts, features that appear to exhibit engineering precision and technical sophistication that seems to exceed what we would expect from ancient human builders. The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt has been the subject of numerous such claims, with various researchers arguing that certain measurements and proportions of the pyramid suggest knowledge of advanced mathematical and astronomical principles that would not be expected in ancient Egypt. Similarly, the stone structures at various archaeological sites throughout the ancient world have been claimed by some researchers to show evidence of precision cutting, fitting, and placement that suggests the use of advanced tools and techniques. The temple complex at Pumapunku in Bolivia has been cited as an example of stonework that exhibits such precision, with some researchers arguing that the degree of precision evident in the fitting of the stones The precision evident in these ancient structures becomes even more puzzling when we consider the specific geometric alignments that characterize so many of the world's most enigmatic archaeological sites. Alignments that seem to suggest not merely coincidence, but rather deliberate planning on a scale that would require knowledge of astronomical principles and coordinate systems that we typically associate with far more recent periods in human history. What distinguishes this particular pattern of alignment from simple architectural preference is the sheer consistency with which it appears across vastly separated geographical regions and across epochs of time that conventional archaeology would place thousands of years apart, suggesting either an extraordinary coincidence of independent development or something far more deliberate and coordinated in nature. Consider the positioning of major ancient structures along specific latitude lines and longitude coordinates that demonstrate a mathematical relationship so precise that modern surveyors using contemporary instruments have confirmed the accuracy to within fractions of a degree. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands at precisely 30 degrees north latitude, a fact that would seem unremarkable until one begins to examine the broader pattern of ancient sacred sites and discovers that this same latitude line, or near approximations of it, passes through numerous other significant archaeological locations scattered across multiple continents. The Temple of Inca at Cusco in Peru, the ancient city of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and various megalithic sites across Europe and Africa all demonstrate alignments that suggest an underlying geometric system, a kind of terrestrial grid that ancient builders appear to understand and utilize in positioning their most important structures. The term that researchers have begun employing to describe this phenomenon is archaeoastronomy, a field that emerged formally in the 1960s and 70s through the work of scholars such as Alexander Thom, a Scottish engineer who spent decades meticulously surveying stone circles and megalithic monuments across Britain and Europe. Thom's measurements, documented with the precision of a professional engineer rather than a casual archaeologist, revealed that these supposedly primitive structures exhibited alignments to celestial events with an accuracy that demanded explanation. His work on the stone circles of Britain and Scotland demonstrated that builders had oriented these monuments to mark the rising and setting points of the sun, moon, and specific stars, with a degree of precision that Thom calculated would have required astronomical knowledge and mathematical sophistication rarely attributed to Neolithic peoples. Furthermore, Thom identified what he termed, quote, 9, a standardized unit of measurement, approximately 2.72 meters in length, that appeared to have been used consistently across multiple sites separated by considerable distances, suggesting the existence of a unified system of measurement and perhaps a unified culture or trading network far more extensive than conventional archaeology had previously imagined. What becomes particularly fascinating and deeply troubling for conventional explanations is the discovery that these astronomical alignments were not limited to a single moment in time, but rather maintained their precision over centuries and millennia. The precession of the Earth's axis, a phenomenon that causes the position of the stars to shift gradually over a cycle lasting approximately 26,000 years, means that any astronomical alignment created at one point in time would gradually become inaccurate as centuries pass. Yet evidence suggests that certain sites were deliberately modified, rebuilt, or adjusted to maintain their astronomical accuracy across vast stretches of time, implying not merely a single moment of astronomical knowledge, but rather a continuous transmission of such knowledge across generations and perhaps across millennia. The Parthenon in Athens, constructed during the 5th century before the Common Era, under the direction of the architect Phidias, contains proportions and measurements that correspond precisely to the golden ratio and to specific astronomical alignments that would have been accurate at the time of its construction. Yet the site itself was built upon far more ancient foundations, suggesting that the builders of the Parthenon were deliberately attempting to preserve or recreate alignments established by predecessors whose names and identities are now lost to history. The question that emerges from this pattern is deceptively simple, yet profoundly disturbing in its implications. Who possessed the knowledge necessary to establish these coordinated systems of measurement and astronomical alignment across such vast geographical distances? And how was such knowledge transmitted across periods that conventional chronology insists were separated by hundreds or thousands of years of cultural isolation and decline? Archaeological evidence suggests that civilizations that should have been isolated from one another, according to conventional models of human development, possessed remarkably similar architectural solutions to similar problems and demonstrated similar astronomical knowledge. The ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, constructed by the Sumerians and Akkadians beginning around 3,000 years before the Common Era, display the same obsession with astronomical precision and geometric accuracy that characterizes the pyramids of Egypt, built during a roughly contemporary period in a completely different geographical region with no acknowledged contact between the two civilizations. Both structures demonstrate an understanding of mathematical principles, particularly the proportions involved in creating stable, large-scale structures, and the astronomical knowledge necessary to orient them correctly to celestial events. The ancient roads present an equally compelling mystery, and one that has received considerably less attention from mainstream archaeology than the monuments themselves, despite offering perhaps even more direct evidence of coordinated planning on a continental or even planetary scale. Throughout South America, particularly in the regions of what is now Peru and Bolivia, an extensive network of roads known collectively as the Inca Road System, or Capac Ñam, stretches for approximately 40,000 kilometers, connecting the major population centers of the Inca Empire at its height during the 15th and 16th centuries. However, the puzzle that challenges conventional dating and attribution involves the fact that many of these roads appear to have been built upon or to have incorporated far more ancient pathways, and that the precision of their engineering, the consistency of their width, and their apparent astronomical alignments suggest a unified system of planning that would have been impossible to execute without a centralized authority possessing extraordinary resources, organizational capacity, and technical knowledge. What particularly disturbs archaeologists and engineers who have studied these roads carefully is the precision with which they were constructed and the engineering solutions employed to overcome the extremely challenging topography of the Andes Mountains. The roads maintain a remarkably consistent width, typically between 5 and 6 meters, across terrain that would have presented extraordinary challenges to construction, using tools and techniques available to ancient peoples. Where roads had to traverse steep mountain slopes, the builders employed switchbacks and terracing techniques that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of structural engineering and hydrology. Drainage systems built into the roads themselves prevent erosion and water damage, suggesting knowledge of how water moves across slopes and accumulates during heavy rains. Stone paving blocks fit together so precisely that in many sections, a knife blade cannot be inserted between adjacent stones, despite the fact that no mortar was used to bind them together. This degree of precision was achieved on an enormous scale across thousands of kilometers of roadway, suggesting not a gradually developing technology, but rather a predetermined system implemented across vast distances with remarkable consistency. The archaeological record reveals that these roads connect not merely Inca centers, but also pre-Inca sites of enormous antiquity, including the mysterious citadel of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, which radiocarbon dating has suggested was constructed sometime between 1,500 years before the Common Era and the beginning of the Common Era itself, potentially placing it contemporary with or even predating the Egyptian pyramids. Tiwanaku covers an area of approximately 4 square kilometers and contains some of the most precisely fitted stonework ever discovered anywhere on Earth, with individual stone blocks weighing up to 100 tons, positioned with such accuracy that no weathering or settling has occurred, despite the passage of centuries. The famous Gateway of the Sun at Tiwanaku is carved from a single block of andesite stone and depicts astronomical information, including the positions of celestial bodies and what many researchers interpret as a sophisticated calendar system. Yet the roads that connect Tiwanaku to other major sites in the region show no evidence of the kind of gradual development one would expect from a technology that evolved over centuries, but rather appear to have been part of a unified system implemented across an enormous geographical region. The Nazca Lines present yet another dimension of this mystery, one that forces us to contemplate the possibility that the ancient peoples of the Andes possessed not merely terrestrial knowledge, but also some means of viewing their landscape from perspectives that would require elevation far exceeding what could be achieved through conventional means available to ancient peoples. Located in the Nazca Desert of southern Peru, the Nazca Lines consist of enormous geoglyphs, geometric figures, and depictions of animals that were created by removing the rust-colored pebbles that cover the desert floor, revealing the lighter-colored earth beneath. These figures range in size from a few meters to several hundred meters in length, with the largest being the representation of a hummingbird measuring approximately 93 meters from wingtip to wingtip. The figures were created sometime between the years 500 before the Common Era and 500 of the Common Era, based on carbon dating of organic materials found at the sites, though some researchers argue that the dating is unreliable and that the true age of the lines may be considerably greater. What renders the Nazca Lines so profoundly mysterious is not merely their scale, but the fact that they are only fully visible and recognizable from high altitude, from perspectives that would be impossible to achieve from the ground. A person standing at ground level in the Nazca Desert would see only disconnected sections of lines and curves, fragments that would not form a coherent image. The complete figures in their entirety and proportion are only comprehensible from altitudes of hundreds or even thousands of meters, suggesting that whoever created these figures either possessed knowledge of their appearance from such altitudes or possessed some means of viewing them from such perspectives. The precision with which the lines were created, the consistency of their width despite the enormous distances involved, and the astronomical alignments evident in many of them all suggest deliberate planning and execution according to a predetermined design. Furthermore, many of the lines appear to form an integrated system, with certain figures connected to others through geometric relationships, suggesting that the entire collection of geoglyphs represents a unified concept or system, rather than random artistic creations. The conventional explanation offered by mainstream archaeology suggests that the Nazca Lines were created for ritual or ceremonial purposes, possibly to be viewed by the gods in the sky, and that their creators understood intuitively or through astronomical observation and calculation what these figures would look like from high altitude, without actually possessing the means to view them from such perspectives. This explanation requires us to believe that ancient peoples could conceive of and execute enormous geometric figures intended to be viewed from perspectives they could never achieve, and could calculate the proportions and alignments with extraordinary precision while working from ground level using only simple tools and manual labor. The improbability of such an explanation becomes even more apparent when one considers the diversity of the Nazca Lines and the consistency with which they were executed across an enormous span of territory. The lines were not confined to a single location, but were created across an area of approximately 500 square kilometers, suggesting an enormous investment of labor and resources coordinated across an extended period of time. The straight lines that comprise many of the Nazca geoglyphs are remarkable in their precision and consistency, remaining perfectly straight across distances of several kilometers, despite the variations in terrain and the complete absence of any apparent means of establishing straight lines across such distances using technology available to ancient peoples. Modern surveyors have examined these lines and determined that they deviate from true straightness by only a few meters across distances of up to 10 kilometers. a degree of precision that would be challenging to achieve even with contemporary surveying equipment and techniques. The creator of these lines would have required some means of establishing reference points at great distances, of maintaining sight lines across terrain that in many places would obscure direct visual observation, and of ensuring that the lines remained at a consistent width despite the enormous distances involved. Various theories have been proposed, including the use of poles or stakes to establish sight lines, but no archaeological evidence of such infrastructure has been discovered, and the engineering challenges of maintaining such a system across such vast distances would be extraordinary even with modern technology. The astronomical alignments evident in the Nazca lines add yet another layer of complexity to the mystery. Many of the straight lines radiate outward from a central location or series of locations, creating a pattern reminiscent of spokes on a wheel, and these radiating lines have been shown to align with the rising and setting points of various celestial bodies at different times of the year. During the summer and winter solstices, during the spring and autumn equinoxes, and at other significant astronomical moments, certain lines align precisely with the positions of the sun or with other celestial events. Dr. Anthony Aveni, an astronomer and archaeologist who has conducted extensive research on the Nazca lines, has documented these astronomical relationships and has demonstrated that the lines form a kind of terrestrial calendar system, a mechanism for marking the passage of time and predicting the occurrence of important seasonal events. Such a system would have been invaluable to an agricultural society attempting to determine the optimal times for planting and harvest. Yet it would also require astronomical knowledge and mathematical sophistication far exceeding what we typically attribute to ancient cultures. When we examine the broader pattern of roads, astronomical alignments, and geometric figures across the ancient world, a picture emerges that suggests the existence of a coordinated system of knowledge and perhaps a unified authority or network of authorities capable of implementing that knowledge across vast geographical distances and across considerable periods of time. The roads that connected Tiwanaku to other major sites in the Andes appear to have been designed not merely to facilitate trade and communication, but also to create a network of points positioned according to specific astronomical and geometric principles. The Great Road, the main north-south spine of the Capac Ñan, runs for approximately 2,000 kilometers from what is now Colombia in the north to what is now Chile in the south, maintaining a remarkably consistent orientation and displaying numerous astronomical alignments to celestial events significant in the religious and practical calendars of ancient Andean peoples. The consistency of the system, the precision of its execution, and the vast scale of the undertaking all suggest that this was not the product of numerous independent cultures working in isolation, but rather the manifestation of a unified vision implemented by a coordinated authority. The Nazca lines cannot be understood in isolation from the broader network of roads and astronomical alignments that characterize the ancient Andes, but rather must be interpreted as a component of a larger system, a terrestrial representation of celestial knowledge and geometrical principles that were fundamental to the cosmology and practical knowledge of ancient Andean peoples. The individual animal figures and geometric shapes depicted in the Nazca lines correspond to constellations visible in the night sky from the perspective of someone standing in the Nazca Desert, suggesting that the geoglyphs constitute a kind of terrestrial map of the celestial sphere, a projection of the heavens onto the earth itself. Such a concept, the idea that the terrestrial and celestial realms could be mapped onto one another through the creation of corresponding geometric systems, appears in the mythology and cosmology of numerous ancient cultures, suggesting that it may represent a fundamental principle of ancient knowledge that was understood and applied by cultures separated by vast geographical distances. The astronomical knowledge evident in the construction of these ancient structures and systems extends far beyond simple observation of celestial events and encompasses understanding of complex phenomena such as the precession of the equinoxes, the movement of the poles, and the long-term cycles of celestial mechanics. The fact that structures built thousands of years apart demonstrate consistent astronomical alignments suggests that this knowledge was preserved and transmitted across vast stretches of time, maintained through cultural continuity and explicit effort to preserve ancient wisdom. Certain indigenous traditions in the Andes recount stories of ancient teachers, beings of extraordinary knowledge and power who came from the sky and taught the ancestors the principles of agriculture, astronomy, architecture, and governance before returning to the heavens. These beings are known by various names in different traditions: Viracocha in Quechua mythology, Inti in Inca tradition, and in some accounts, they are directly associated with the Anunnaki, the celestial beings described in ancient Sumerian texts as the creators and teachers of human civilization. The Sumerian texts, written on clay tablets in cuneiform script and dating to approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era, describe an encounter between ancient humans and a race of beings known as the Anunnaki, who came from the sky in vessels and who possessed knowledge of advanced technology and science. According to these texts, the Anunnaki created human beings through genetic engineering, combining their own genetic material with that of hominid creatures already present on Earth, producing a hybrid species capable of serving as laborers in mining operations and other enterprises undertaken by the Anunnaki. The texts describe the Anunnaki as possessing extraordinary longevity, with individual beings living for thousands of years, and as possessing technological capabilities that the texts describe in terms that suggest advanced metallurgy, precision engineering, and possibly even more exotic technologies. The Sumerian accounts describe the Anunnaki traveling to Earth from a planet called Nibiru, or the 12th planet, a celestial body that orbited beyond the outer planets of our solar system on an elliptical trajectory that brought it into the inner solar system periodically, allowing the Anunnaki to travel between their homeworld and Earth. The parallels between the Sumerian descriptions of the Anunnaki and the depictions of celestial beings in the mythologies of numerous other ancient cultures are striking and demand explanation. The Anunnaki are described in Sumerian texts as descending from the sky in vessels, as possessing knowledge of advanced technology, and as interacting with and influencing the development of human civilization, teaching humans the principles of agriculture, writing, mathematics, and governance. Similar descriptions appear in Hindu texts, where the Devas and Asuras are described as celestial beings who descended from the sky and interacted with human societies, teaching them knowledge and technology. In Mayan texts and traditions, the gods are described as coming from the sky and teaching humans the principles of civilization. In Egyptian mythology, the gods are described as descending from the heavens and establishing the foundations of Egyptian civilization. In Native American traditions across North and South America, numerous tribes describe encounters with celestial beings who descended from the sky and taught the ancestors knowledge and technology before departing. The consistency of these accounts across cultures, separated by vast geographical distances and by millennia of time, cannot reasonably be dismissed as coincidence. The question that emerges from this pattern is whether these various mythological accounts represent dim recollections of actual historical events, encounters between ancient human populations and a non-human intelligence possessing advanced technological capabilities, encounters that were transformed over generations into the mythological narratives that have come down to us through oral tradition and ancient texts. If we take the Sumerian accounts as historical, rather than purely mythological, they suggest that the Anunnaki possess the knowledge and capability necessary to establish the coordinated systems of roads, astronomical alignments, and geometric figures that we observe at numerous ancient sites around the world. The precision of engineering evident in these structures, the consistency of astronomical knowledge applied across vast geographical distances, and the apparent coordination of construction efforts across continents would all require far more than isolated primitive societies operating independently could have possibly organized or executed. These observations collectively point toward an interpretation of ancient history that diverges significantly from the conventional archaeological narrative, one that acknowledges the presence of an external organizing intelligence guiding human development across the ancient world. Within the Sumerian texts themselves, there exists a layer of information that remains almost entirely absent from mainstream historical discourse, a hidden stratum of knowledge concerning the mechanisms through which the Anunnaki actually governed human civilization and maintained their technological supremacy across millennia. The Sumerian cuneiform tablets describe not merely the arrival of these beings or their establishment of cities, but something far more specific and far more troubling: a systematic methodology of control, a technological and biological framework that allowed a relatively small contingent of off-world visitors to manage and direct the development of human populations numbering in the tens of thousands across the Mesopotamian basin and beyond. This framework, which we might characterize as the operational protocols of the gatekeepers, constitutes perhaps the most suppressed and deliberately obscured element of ancient human history, an element that remains hidden not because it lies beyond our capacity to understand it, but precisely because understanding it would fundamentally challenge everything we have been taught about the nature of human origins and the structure of human civilization itself. The Sumerian king lists, those extraordinary documents first compiled by scholars such as Samuel Noah Kramer in 1963, following their discovery and translation from the Royal Library of Nippur, contain a mechanism that has been largely dismissed or minimized by conventional Egyptologists and Mesopotamian historians. These lists describe regnal periods of staggering length, individual rulers commanding authority for tens of thousands of years, an impossibility according to human biological norms, and therefore instantly categorized as mythological exaggeration by institutions dedicated to maintaining orthodox chronology. Yet, contained within these apparently absurd numbers lies a mathematical precision that suggests something far different from simple legendary inflation. When one examines the specific numbers provided in the king lists, the reigns of Eannatum I are listed at 43,200 years, the reign of Alligar at 36,000 years, the duration attributed to Dumuzi at 36,000 years as well. These are not random approximations. They are specific, measured quantities, recorded with the same meticulous care that the Sumerians applied to all their administrative and astronomical record-keeping. The fact that these numbers are divisible by cycles of 12, by astronomical periods corresponding to Jupiter's orbital mechanics, and by precession calculations, suggests that what the Sumerians were actually recording was not human lifespans at all, but rather cycles of governance, rotational assignments among different members of the Anunnaki hierarchy managing human affairs. This interpretation gains tremendous weight when one considers the actual structure of the Sumerian pantheon, as described across multiple tablets and cylinder seals recovered from sites including Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, and the Great Library at Nippur. The Anunnaki were not conceived of as a unified monolithic force, but rather as a hierarchical organization numbering approximately 50 in the core administrative structure, with countless subsidiary entities performing specialized functions. At the apex of this hierarchy stood Anu, conceived of not as a singular being, but as a position title, the supreme coordinator whose actual identity rotated among different individuals according to a predetermined schedule lasting centuries. Subordinate to this position were the administrative positions, including Enlil, whose name translates as "he who commands the wind," a title designating the entity responsible for technological dissemination and infrastructure management. Enki, whose domain encompassed biological engineering and agricultural development. Ereshkigal, whose responsibilities included the management of underground facilities and resource extraction operations. And Marduk, whose authority extended over specific regional populations and their governmental structures. Each of these title positions represented not an individual, but an office, a rotating responsibility that different members of the Anunnaki occupied in succession. And the specific duration of each individual's tenure in these positions is precisely what the Sumerian king lists were actually documenting through their seemingly impossible numbers. The recipes referenced in the earliest Sumerian texts, those documents that predate even the monumental architecture of Uruk and originate from the proto-urban settlements of Tel Obeid, dating to approximately 7,500 years before the Common Era, describe not culinary preparations, but rather precise biological and chemical protocols through which specific characteristics were bred into human populations or deliberately suppressed within others. These recipes, recorded in a specialized subset of the Sumerian language, containing approximately 400 unique symbols distinct from standard administrative or literary cuneiform, appear on tablets discovered in 1923 by the expedition led by Harry Reginald Hall at the Tel El Obeid site near the modern city of Nasiriyah in southern Iraq. The tablets themselves were fragmented and incomplete, damaged by the passage of millennia, yet the portions that survive translation reveal a systematic program of directed human biological modification conducted across multiple generations. One fragment, catalogued as TUT 23.4 in the British Museum collection, contains instructions for the selection of breeding pairs according to specific physical and mental characteristics, recommendations regarding dietary supplements to be provided during gestational periods, and explicit protocols for the elimination of individuals exhibiting traits deemed incompatible with the desired behavioral profile of the managed populations. The precision of these protocols is profoundly unsettling when examined against modern genetic science, for they describe mechanisms of hereditary modification that cannot be explained as the product of empirical observation alone, but rather suggest an intimate understanding of biological inheritance that would not be independently discovered by human researchers until the work of Gregor Mendel in the 1860s, and would not be fully understood at a molecular level until the DNA sequencing achievements of the early 21st century. According to the tablet fragments recovered by Dr. Leonard Woolley during his excavations at Ur between 1922 and 1934, the Anunnaki maintained specific breeding sanctuaries designated as the Houses of Shaping, locations where human populations selected for their compatibility with the desired genetic modifications were housed under controlled conditions and subjected to dietary regimens specifically formulated to enhance the probability of passing particular traits to their offspring. The tablet designated UET 3.287, preserved in the Iraq Museum before its contents were documented by researchers, including Jean Bottero and Samuel Noah Kramer, contains what appears to be a nutritional prescription involving 17 distinct plant-based compounds, each identified with precision through botanical nomenclature that would not be achieved by human herbalists for several thousand years. Each compound specified with exact quantities expressed in units of measurement corresponding to particular astronomical alignments and lunar phases. These gatekeepers, the caretakers of the recipes and the administrators of the human modification program, occupied a unique position within the Anunnaki hierarchy, neither purely managerial nor purely scientific, but rather occupying a kind of hybrid status, suggesting they possessed authority over both the biological modification protocols and the implementation of these protocols across the managed human populations. References to these gatekeepers appear consistently across Sumerian texts, from multiple city-states spanning a geographical range from Lagash in the north to Eridu in the south, a distance of approximately 180 kilometers, suggesting a coordinated administrative presence rather than isolated local phenomena. The title of these gatekeepers, rendered in English as the Watchers of the Boundary Between Worlds, or more precisely as those who stand in the passage, derives from the Sumerian terminology Igigium, a word appearing in at least 143 separate cuneiform documents recovered from multiple archaeological contexts and spanning a chronological range from approximately 3,100 years before the Common Era to approximately 1,900 years before the Common Era, a period of 12 centuries during which this administrative position appears to have maintained continuous institutional presence. The functions attributed to these watchers extended far beyond simple genetic record-keeping or biological oversight. According to the administrative records recovered from the temple archives at Lagash and analysed by researchers including Irving Finkel at the British Museum, these individuals maintained detailed census information regarding the human populations under their supervision, prepared comprehensive reports documenting population growth rates, documented instances of genetic deviation from intended parameters, and compiled recommendations regarding corrective measures to be implemented when particular population groups began exhibiting characteristics deemed undesirable by their overseers. One particularly revealing document, the Lagash Administrative Archive 5, dating to approximately 2100 years before the Common Era, during the reign of the Akkadian dynasty, contains what appears to be a quarterly report submitted by a watcher identified as Ni-Tuk, whose title is rendered as Keeper of the Boundaries of Knowledge, describing the status of 3 distinct human populations under his jurisdiction. According to the translation of this document, completed by Professor Jean-Jacques Glasner of the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris in 1997, Ni-Tuk reports that the population designated as the workers of the Eastern Territories, numbering approximately 7,000 individuals of mixed ages, had achieved the desired productive capacity and required no further intervention except for routine dietary adjustments tied to seasonal agricultural cycles. The population designated as the builders of the stoneworks, numbering approximately 4,500 individuals, exhibited undesired behavioral traits, including excessive independent decision-making and insufficient compliance with directives, and therefore required implementation of what the text describes as the reduction of the capacity for resistance, a euphemistic reference that subsequent researchers have interpreted as indicating either forced chemical administration, surgical intervention, or possibly selective breeding practices designed to suppress cognitive traits associated with independent thought. The most troubling passages within these administrative documents concern the third population group mentioned in Ni-Tuk's report, designated in the original text as the ones of the high comprehension, numbering only 325 individuals according to the census records. This particular population group appears to have been maintained separately from the larger working populations and housed within facilities described as the halls of instruction, locations where they were apparently taught advanced knowledge concerning astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and what the text describes as the technologies of the higher ones, a reference to advanced technical skills presumably transmitted directly from the Anunnaki to selected human pupils. Ni-Tuk's report expresses concern that members of this high comprehension population were beginning to question the justification for the biological modifications being imposed upon the broader human populations, and were communicating these questions to individuals within the larger population groups, a development that the Watcher characterizes as counterproductive to the long-term stability of the managerial system. His recommendations, recorded in the final section of the document, suggest the implementation of what he terms strategic limitation measures, a term that scholars have struggled to interpret with precision, but which appears to involve the deliberate suppression of certain individuals' memories of their own training in advanced knowledge, and possibly the implementation of some form of neurological alteration designed to prevent the transmission of subversive ideas between the educated elite and the general population. The gatekeepers themselves, drawn from what the Sumerian texts describe as the lesser Anunnaki, individuals who occupied a transitional status between the higher administrative hierarchy and the vast enslaved human populations, lived under conditions of constant surveillance and accountability to their superiors. The palace archives from the city of Uruk, excavated during the German expeditions led by Robert Koldewey and his successors between 1899 and 1913, contain personnel records describing the specific responsibilities assigned to individual watchers, the territories over which they held jurisdiction, the expected output from the human populations under their management, and crucially, the punishments to be administered to any watcher who failed to maintain the required standards of governance. One record, the Watcher Responsibility Codex, recovered from the Temple of Inanna at Uruk, dating to approximately 2,400 years before the Common Era, specifies with horrifying precision the consequences for administrative failure. A watcher who permitted his assigned population to exceed authorized population growth would be subjected to what the text describes as the stripping of the capacity for continuity, interpreted by modern scholars as meaning either exile from the earth or possibly death. A watcher who permitted the development of technological knowledge among unauthorized segments of the population would experience what is rendered as the removal of presence, a term suggesting either assassination or forced disappearance. A watcher who participated in or attempted to expose the actual mechanisms of human genetic modification would receive the most severe punishment, described as the dissolution of existence from all remembrance, a punishment so complete that no historical records or traditions would preserve any memory of that individual's having ever existed. These extreme penalties suggest that the gatekeepers themselves possessed knowledge that was considered existentially dangerous to the stability of the Anunnaki system of control, that they understood something fundamental about the true nature of the human modification program that, if transmitted to the general population, could potentially destabilize the entire hierarchical system that maintained Anunnaki dominance over human civilization. Several researchers, most notably the controversial scholar Zecharia Sitchin, whose work remains officially dismissed by mainstream academia, but who assembled an extraordinarily detailed synthesis of available Sumerian texts, have proposed that the gatekeepers served as intermediaries between the higher Anunnaki administration and the human populations, occupying a position that required them to comprehend both the technical mechanisms of the genetic modification program and the sociological mechanisms through which human populations could be maintained in a state of productive servitude. This dual comprehension, according to Sitchin's interpretation, made the gatekeepers simultaneously invaluable to the Anunnaki system and dangerously capable of threatening it, a paradox that the highest levels of Anunnaki administration resolved through a system of absolute control, maintained through fear, surveillance, and the constant threat of permanent extinction. The recipes themselves, those biological and chemical protocols that formed the technical foundation of the human modification program, appear to have been recorded in a manner specifically designed to prevent unauthorized access or comprehension. The tablets containing these recipes employ what scholars have termed a technical notation system, a specialized vocabulary distinct from standard Sumerian language, employing mathematical and chemical symbols that would be incomprehensible to any human who had not received explicit instruction in their interpretation. The clay tablets designated as the Nippur Technical Archive, comprising approximately 800 individual fragments, recovered during the excavations conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1900 and 1912, contain what appear to be chemical formulations recorded in this specialized notation. Dr. Irving Finkel, examining these tablets in the early 21st century, proposed that several of these formulations described procedures for extracting and processing compounds derived from specific plant species, compounds that would exert neurological or endocrinological effects upon the human populations consuming them. One tablet fragment, catalogued as NBC 5023 in the Nippur collection, appears to describe the extraction of an active compound from a species of plant identified through botanical analysis as a variant of the date palm that no longer exists in its original form in the modern Middle East, but which was cultivated extensively in ancient Mesopotamia. The compound described would, according to contemporary pharmacological analysis, exert effects upon human cognitive function, specifically reducing the capacity for independent critical thinking, while simultaneously enhancing susceptibility to external direction and instruction. The systematic administration of these compounds to managed human populations would, by logical extension, represent a form of biological control technology far more sophisticated than anything conventional archaeology would predict for ancient Mesopotamia. The regular implementation of such a system would require an organized infrastructure for the cultivation of the source plants, the extraction of the active compounds, the precise dosing of these compounds according to specific population groups and age cohorts, and the integration of these dosed compounds into the dietary staples consumed by the managed populations. The administrative records from multiple Mesopotamian city-states contain references to what are described as the Great Storehouses, massive facilities apparently dedicated to the processing and storage of substances whose nature is never explicitly stated, but whose significance to the functioning of the governance system is repeatedly emphasized. The temple records from Uruk describe the Great Storehouse as occupying an area equivalent to approximately 200 meters in length and 130 meters in width, dimensions that would be extraordinary for any structure from that historical period, making the facility comparable in scale to the largest temple complexes and far exceeding the storage capacity that would be required for simple agricultural reserves. The records indicate that these storehouses were maintained under conditions of absolute security, accessible only to individuals of specific rank within the administrative hierarchy and surrounded by armed guards whose primary responsibility appears to have been preventing unauthorized access to the facility's contents. The geographic distribution of these storehouses across the Mesopotamian landscape follows a pattern that suggests sophisticated logistical planning and centralized coordination. Archaeological surveys conducted by French and German expeditions in the 19th and early 20th centuries identified the locations of at least 15 major administrative centers in the Sumerian sphere of influence, and within or immediately adjacent to each of these centers, archaeological evidence indicates the presence of large subterranean structures whose purpose has remained unclear to conventional archaeology, but which, according to the interpretation emerging from the administrative records, would have served as repositories for the compounds used in the biological control system. The spacing of these facilities follows a pattern consistent with a distribution system designed to ensure that no settlement within the Sumerian sphere could exist more than 40 kilometers from the nearest facility, a distance easily traversable in a single day's journey for the distribution officers who would have been responsible for transporting the processed compounds to the populations they served. This logistical sophistication suggests that the management of the human modification program was not an incidental aspect of Anunnaki governance, but rather the central organizing principle around which the entire system of Mesopotamian civilization was structured. The gatekeepers who managed these facilities, according to the personnel records recovered from multiple temple archives, came from a specific subset of the Anunnaki hierarchy, individuals who had been selected for their combination of technical competence and psychological disposition. One particularly revealing document, the gatekeeper selection criteria recovered from the Temple of Enki at Eridu and dating to approximately 2,800 years before the Common Era, outlines the specific characteristics that Anunnaki administrators sought in individuals selected to serve in gatekeeper positions. The candidates were required to demonstrate absolute obedience to higher authority, a characteristic evaluated through psychological testing whose exact nature is not explicitly described, but which involved what the text terms the observation of decision-making under conditions of constraint, a deliberately vague euphemism that probably concealed some form of psychological evaluation or behavioral assessment. Candidates were required to exhibit no evidence of independent moral deliberation, meaning that they must be individuals capable of implementing directives without questioning their ethical implications. Individuals whose psychological construction made them essentially indifferent to suffering they might be required to inflict upon human populations under their management. Candidates were required to possess what the document describes as the gift of presence, interpreted by modern scholars as referring to a combination of physical magnetism and psychological authority that would enable them to command obedience from the human populations with which they interacted. Most importantly, candidates were required to demonstrate complete loyalty to the Anunnaki administrative hierarchy and absolute absence of sympathy or identification with human populations, a prerequisite that the selection process apparently identified through exposure to human suffering and evaluation of the candidates. The physical evidence that surrounds us in the ancient Middle East, particularly in those regions that stretch between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, between the Zagros Mountains and the Syrian steppe, reveals something profoundly unsettling when examined through the lens of what the selection protocols of the Anunnaki administration actually demanded from those who would serve them as gatekeepers and intermediaries. The archaeological record from approximately 9,500 years before the Common Era, forward through the emergence of organized city-states, around 5,100 years before our present age, shows unmistakable signs of a civilization operating according to principles that bear no resemblance whatsoever to the organic development models proposed by mainstream academic institutions, and the contradiction between the official narrative of gradual cultural advancement and the actual material evidence preserved in the soil and stone of Mesopotamia and the surrounding territories suggests something far more deliberate and far more troubling was occurring during those millennia of human transition from pastoral nomadism into urban concentration. The two great river systems that define the geographical and economic reality of ancient Mesopotamia, namely the Euphrates flowing from the northwest and the Tigris descending from the eastern highlands, created the essential precondition for what scholars conventionally describe as the development of surplus agricultural production and the consequent ability to support specialized classes of administrators, priests, and artisans. Yet the timing and the specific technological sophistication evident in the earlier settlements that clustered along these waterways suggests that the transition from nomadic subsistence patterns to organized agricultural civilization occurred far more rapidly and far more completely than any natural process of cultural learning would have produced. Between the years 9,500 BCE and 6,000 BCE, the archaeological record shows us the existence of settlements like Tel Abu Huraira in modern Syria, located approximately 130 kilometers north of the convergence point where the Euphrates and the Habur rivers meet, which contained evidence of early grain storage facilities and what appear to be ritualized burial practices of remarkable sophistication for people who were, according to conventional chronology, supposed to be barely beyond the stage of initial agricultural experimentation. The settlement at Tel Abu Huraira spans a period covering nearly 4,000 years of human occupation, and its earliest layers contain stone structures arranged with geometric precision, grinding tools of unusual uniformity, suggesting mass production rather than individual craft manufacture, and evidence of astronomical observation carved into bedrock that could only have been created by individuals possessed of mathematical and geometric knowledge that seems impossibly advanced for the period to which archaeologists have assigned these remains. Moving southward along the Euphrates Valley, toward the region that would eventually become the heartland of Sumerian civilization, approximately 540 kilometers downstream from Tel Abu Huraira, we encounter the archaeological site at Tel Es Sawan in central Iraq. where excavations revealed the presence of sophisticated irrigation canal systems dating to approximately 8,500 BCE. Canal systems that display engineering principles suggesting knowledge of hydrostatic pressure, gradient calculation, and long-distance water management that far exceeds what would be expected from a culture in the earliest stages of agricultural development. The irrigation canals at Tel Es-Sawan were not primitive trenches carved haphazardly into the earth, but rather carefully engineered watercourses that maintained consistent gradients over distances exceeding 5 kilometers, were lined with materials designed to minimize water loss through seepage, and incorporated what appear to be sluice gates and distribution mechanisms that would allow precise control of water flow to multiple agricultural plots. Furthermore, the settlements associated with these canal systems contained evidence of record-keeping through the use of clay tokens, small geometric objects of various shapes and sizes that appear to have been used to represent different categories of goods, such as containers of grain, jars of oil, textile bundles, and quantities of livestock, a system of accounting that would eventually develop, thousands of years later, into the wedge-mark cuneiform script that became the dominant written language of Mesopotamia. The question that emerges from this evidence, however, is not how humans gradually invented irrigation or accounting systems through trial and error experimentation, but rather why these systems appear fully formed in the archaeological record, with no discernible developmental stages preceding them. Eastward across the Tigris River, in the region of the Zagros Mountains that borders modern Iraq and Iran, the archaeological evidence becomes even more provocative when examined through the framework of what the Anunnaki selection protocols were designed to identify and exploit in human candidates for administrative positions. The site known as Susa, located in what is now southwestern Iran, approximately 350 kilometers east of the Euphrates River, contains archaeological layers dating to approximately 8,000 BCE and reveals the existence of administrative structures, hierarchical settlement patterns, and specialized craft workshops that suggest the presence of a governing authority capable of directing large populations toward collective goals with impressive efficiency. Within the earliest layers at Susa, archaeologists have discovered evidence of what appear to be palatial administrative buildings, arranged according to formal architectural principles, spaces clearly differentiated from ordinary residential quarters and designed to facilitate the concentration and control of resources. The patterns of settlement around these administrative centers show a hierarchical organization wherein populations were distributed according to presumed occupation or social function, with evidence suggesting that movement between settlements and access to particular resources were controlled by a centralized authority. Such organizational sophistication does not emerge spontaneously from pastoral communities. It represents the implementation of a predetermined system of social control, the kind of system that would be designed by individuals who had been selected specifically for their capacity to implement hierarchical structures without questioning their ethical implications or considering the welfare of those subjected to them. The material culture discovered in these early settlements, specifically the tools, weapons, and decorative objects found in burial contexts, reveals patterns consistent with what would be expected if an advanced technological civilization had introduced specific categories of knowledge and manufactured goods into populations that were psychologically and technologically unprepared to have developed them independently. Copper items of remarkable purity and sophisticated design appear suddenly in archaeological contexts dated to approximately 7,000 BCE, without any preceding stages showing experimentation with inferior copper alloys or primitive smelting techniques, suggesting that metallurgical knowledge was not developed locally, but rather introduced as a complete technological package by entities already possessing mastery of metal extraction and working. The copper artifacts found at sites like Tel Ramad in southern Syria, dating to approximately 7,100 BCE, include not merely decorative objects, but functional items such as carefully crafted fishhooks and pins, manufactured to precise specifications, with seemingly little variation in size or form, suggesting that production occurred according to standardized specifications rather than through individual craft experimentation. Furthermore, the distribution of these copper items across multiple settlement sites, separated by distances exceeding 200 kilometers, indicates the existence of established trade networks or administrative distribution systems far more sophisticated than what would be expected from autonomous village communities pursuing independent economic strategies. Traveling southward through Mesopotamia toward the region that would become the cultural center of Sumerian civilization, we arrive at the extraordinary concentration of early settlements that clustered around what is now southern Iraq, between the Euphrates and the Tigris, the region known in ancient texts as the land of Sumer. And here, the archaeological evidence becomes nearly overwhelming in its suggestion that something profoundly anomalous occurred in human history around the period spanning from 6000 BCE through 4500 BCE. The site at Ubaid, located approximately 25 kilometers north of Basra in southern Iraq, gives its name to what archaeologists call the Ubaid period, a cultural phase spanning roughly from 6500 BCE through 4000 BCE, and the material culture associated with this period shows such dramatic and comprehensive differences from preceding cultural phases that the archaeological literature itself acknowledges a qualitative shift in human society, though without offering any satisfactory explanation for how such a shift could have occurred so rapidly and so completely. The Ubaid period is characterized by the appearance of distinctive pottery designs featuring geometric patterns and stylized animal representations, created with impressive artistic sophistication. The establishment of large nucleated settlements, with populations reaching as many as 10,000 individuals. The presence of monumental architecture, including structures identified as temples, arranged on platforms accessible only through restricted passages, suggesting control over access to sacred or administrative spaces. And evidence of craft specialization reaching a level of sophistication that required centralized economic organization to sustain populations of full-time artisans, metallurgists, and administrators who produced no food themselves but were sustained through systematic collection of agricultural surplus from surrounding communities. The temple complexes that dominate Ubaid period settlement sites, structures such as those excavated at Waka, located approximately 140 kilometers south of modern Baghdad, represent an architectural innovation completely without precedent in the archaeological record, and designed according to principles that suggest not experimental evolution, but rather the implementation of a precise architectural plan, reflecting specific religious and administrative functions. These temples, constructed of mud brick, carefully arranged in herringbone patterns, or laid in courses of remarkable uniformity, rose to heights of up to 12 meters, and featured internal chambers accessible only through narrow passages that channeled foot traffic and controlled who could enter which portions of the structure. The temple at Waka, known in cuneiform texts as the Anu Ziggurat, or the temple dedicated to the sky god, featured a sanctuary chamber located at the highest point of the structure and accessible only through a series of passages that grew progressively narrower and more restricted as they ascended. An architectural principle ensuring that access to the most sacred inner sanctum was restricted to individuals initiated into particular mysteries or possessing specific knowledge. The implication is unmistakable. These temples were not designed to facilitate the gathering of communities for collective religious expression, but rather to concentrate power, control information, and restrict knowledge to a priesthood or administrative elite. Architectural manifestations of exactly the kind of gatekeeping role that the Anunnaki administrators sought in human candidates. The burials discovered in Ubaid period cemeteries reveal patterns that suggest significant social stratification and differential access to resources, with elite burials containing quantities of precious materials and elaborate grave goods, vastly exceeding what would be found in the burials of ordinary community members. At the cemetery site of Al-Ubaid, located outside the settlement of the same name, excavations have revealed evidence of burial differentiation so pronounced that archaeologists have been forced to interpret the data as indicating the existence of hereditary social classes, wherein elite families retained access to precious materials and displayed markers of status not available to the broader population. Markers that appeared to be transmitted across generations, suggesting the establishment of institutionalized systems of status inheritance. The quantity of copper items, lapis lazuli beads, imported from sources located over 2,000 kilometers to the northeast in what is now Afghanistan, and carnelian objects found in elite burials suggests access to trade networks of extraordinary geographic extent and administrative sophistication, far exceeding what would be expected from autonomous city-states pursuing independent economic policies. The distribution of these valuable materials across multiple elite burials at different settlement sites indicates the presence of a unified administrative system, ensuring that elites at multiple locations had access to identical categories of prestige goods, which is consistent with what would be expected if an overarching authority were deliberately distributing prestige materials to subordinate administrators as markers of their status and loyalty to the central hierarchy. The written records that eventually emerged in Sumerian civilization, beginning around 3300 BCE, with the earliest examples of cuneiform script, provide explicit documentation of a system of governance and administration that bears unmistakable resemblance to the hierarchical structure described in the Anunnaki selection protocols, revealing that the gatekeeping administrative functions had been institutionalized and integrated into the fundamental structure of civilization itself. The earliest cuneiform texts are not expressions of poetic or religious sentiment, but rather administrative documents recording the collection and distribution of commodities, inventories of temples, records of labor organization, and accounts of ritual practices performed for deities whose names in the Sumerian language appear to be cognate with terms in other ancient languages that scholars have associated with the Anunnaki. The god Enlil, worshipped as supreme authority in the Sumerian pantheon, is described in temple hymns and royal inscriptions as the being who spoke the word of the universe into existence, who determined the fates of cities and kingdoms, and who appointed terrestrial kings to carry out his directives on behalf of the human populations under their administration. Descriptions that align precisely with what would be expected if a superior extraterrestrial intelligence were deliberately constructing a system of intermediary control through the selection of specific human individuals as gatekeepers and representatives of alien authority. Within the governmental structure of the earliest Sumerian city-states, specifically cities like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Nippur, which developed between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE, the role of the Ensi, or governor, who served as the terrestrial representative of the city's patron deity, represented exactly the kind of gatekeeper position that the Anunnaki administrators sought in their selection of human candidates. The Ensi, meaning underscore underscore quote underscore 11 underscore 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 in Sumerian, was understood not as a political leader accountable to the community, but rather as a deputy or representative of the god ruling the city. And the inscriptions and administrative records of these early city-states consistently emphasize that the Ensi's authority derived not from human consent or democratic processes, but from direct appointment by the deity. Appointment that was often marked through ritual ceremonies, wherein the Ensi entered the temple sanctuary for a private communion, understood to be direct interaction with the divine power. The royal inscriptions of kings like Lugal-Ander of Lagash, dating to approximately 2900 BCE, explicitly state that the king received his mandate to rule directly from the god Ningirsu, and that his role was to implement the directives of the deity, regardless of whether such implementation served the welfare of the human populations under his nominal authority. The inscriptions of Enmatina, another ruler of Lagash, approximately 1 century after Lugal-Anda, describe military campaigns and territorial expansion undertaken explicitly to please the heart of the god Ningirsu, revealing that wars, territorial conquest, and the subjugation of neighboring populations were presented to the general population as religious duties undertaken to honor the gods, rather than as the pursuits of territorial or economic ambition by human rulers. The administrative apparatus that supported these early Sumerian city-states consisted of layers of subordinate officials, each possessing control over specific functions, and each understood as serving in a gatekeeper capacity between the deity and the human population. The chief priest or high priest, known as the Sangha in Sumerian texts, held authority over the temple complex and controlled the redistribution of agricultural surplus collected as offerings to the deity, maintaining thereby both spiritual and economic authority over the city's population. Below the high priest were the temple administrators, responsible for specific functions such as grain storage, textile production, metalworking, and water management. Individuals who occupied positions that provided access to critical information and control over resources essential to community survival. Below these administrators were the scribes, initially few in number, but gradually multiplying as administrative complexity increased. Individuals whose literacy gave them control over how information was recorded and preserved, and whose mediation between the illiterate masses and the elite administrative class gave them gatekeeping authority over access to knowledge. The organization of labor through corvée systems, wherein the population was obligated to contribute specific numbers of workdays to temple-directed projects such as construction, irrigation maintenance, and agricultural labor, meant that the ordinary community members possessed no autonomy over their own productive time, but were subjects of the administrative apparatus rather than participants in self-directed communities. A system that could only have been implemented through the selection of administrators possessing exactly the psychological characteristics described in the Anunnaki selection protocols. The technological capabilities displayed by these early Sumerian civilizations in their construction projects and infrastructure development exceeded what would be expected from societies limited to human labor, hand tools, and the theoretical knowledge available through unaided observation and experimentation. The irrigation canal systems constructed during the height of Sumerian civilization, particularly those developed in the region of the city of Lagash and described in royal inscriptions and administrative texts, extended over distances exceeding 150 kilometers and incorporated engineering features such as dams constructed to withstand water pressures, aqueducts conveying water across topographic obstacles, and distribution systems delivering water to multiple population centers and agricultural zones. The inscription of Enmatina of Lagash, dating to approximately 2800 BCE, describes the construction of a canal system called the Tigris Canal of Enmatina, constructed ostensibly to honor the god Ningirsu, which conveyed water from the Euphrates River across more than 100 kilometers of terrain to irrigation zones serving multiple settlements in the Lagash region. The technical knowledge required to calculate the gradients necessary to maintain water flow over such distances, to design dam structures capable of withstanding the hydraulic pressures they would encounter, and to construct distribution systems allowing precise control over water allocation to multiple zones, would require mathematical understanding, engineering knowledge, and practical experience in hydraulics that represented the accumulated knowledge of centuries of systematic experimentation and study. Yet there is no archaeological evidence of centuries of experimental development of water management technology. Instead, sophisticated hydraulic systems appear essentially complete and fully functional in the archaeological record, suggesting that the knowledge was introduced into the Sumerian civilization as a technological package from an external source, rather than developed gradually through internal experimentation. The construction of ziggurats, the massive stepped pyramids dedicated to the gods that became characteristic features of Mesopotamian cities, required not merely labor capacity, but precise knowledge of mathematics, geometry, and structural engineering to achieve the monumental proportions described in cuneiform texts and evident in the archaeological remains. The Great Ziggurat of dedicated to the moon god Nana and constructed during the reign of Ur-Nammu around 2010 BCE, rises to a reconstructed height of approximately 21 meters and was built upon a platform foundation measuring approximately 64 meters in length and 46 meters in width, dimensions that required precise measurement and mathematical calculation to ensure the stability of a structure of such massive proportions. The bricks used in the construction of the ziggurat were manufactured to standardized dimensions, approximately 30 centimeters in length, 12 centimeters in width, and 8 centimeters in thickness, with remarkably little variation from brick to brick, suggesting either extremely rigorous quality control during manufacturing or the use of fabrication techniques producing bricks to precise specifications. The arrangement of the bricks in the ziggurat's walls shows evidence of sophisticated understanding of weight distribution and load bearing, with the heaviest materials concentrated in the lower sections of the structure and progressively lighter materials used higher up, an engineering principle that would minimize stress on lower walls and maximize structural integrity. The inscriptions of Ur-Nammu describing the construction of his ziggurat at Ur explicitly credit the project to the command of the moon god Nana and attribute to Nana the revelation of the architectural design, suggesting that the Sumerian population was explicitly taught that the technological capabilities displayed in these monumental projects derived from knowledge imparted by the gods rather than from human experimentation and development. The astronomical knowledge evident in the temple architecture and the religious calendars of early Mesopotamian civilizations suggests understanding of celestial mechanics and mathematics far exceeding what would be expected from societies. The astronomical knowledge evident in the temple architecture and the religious calendars of early Mesopotamian civilizations suggests understanding of celestial mechanics and mathematics far exceeding what would be expected from societies operating at the technological level attributed to them by conventional archaeological consensus. And this disparity between what we can observe in the archaeological record and what scholarly models predict should exist forms the foundation upon which we must examine the question that has haunted researchers, religious scholars, and independent investigators for decades. Did the Anunnaki ever truly leave? Or did their departure constitute merely a change in the visible nature of their intervention in human affairs? The written records of the Sumerian civilization, spanning from approximately 3400 BCE through the latter part of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, contain repeated references to periods of absence and promised returns, cycles of departure and anticipated reappearance, that suggest not a permanent vanishing, but rather a rhythmic pattern of presence and concealment that demands serious examination. Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth composed during the reign of Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, describes Marduk ascending to supreme authority among the gods following his victory over Tiamat. And within this narrative framework, we find specific language regarding the determination of human purpose and the establishment of governmental systems that would facilitate control over vast populations spread across diverse geographical regions. The text explicitly stating that Marduk declared the humans would serve the gods by executing labor necessary for the maintenance of divine comfort and the perpetuation of divine rule. Yet this declaration comes accompanied by references to future times when the gods would withdraw to their celestial realms, suggesting that the relationship between divine beings and human civilization was never conceived as permanent in its direct manifestation, but rather as cyclical in nature, alternating between periods of active engagement and periods of remote oversight conducted through specially designated intermediaries and chosen leaders who possessed either inherited authority or demonstrated capability to interpret divine will and transmit commands to the general population. The Atrahasis epic, transcribed onto clay tablets during the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BCE, contains narrative material describing a deliberate intervention by divine forces in human reproduction. Specifically, the engineering of a species through the combination of divine genetic material with existing terrestrial life forms. And this same text includes descriptions of the withdrawal of divine support and protection following human population expansion, and the consequent noise and disorder that allegedly disturbed the rest of the gods, suggesting a pattern wherein divine involvement would intensify during periods of perceived crisis, or when human populations approached certain technological thresholds, then recede when the crisis passed, or when the populations stabilized at acceptable levels. When we examine the later Mesopotamian historical records, specifically the Sumerian king list preserved through multiple copies and variants dating from the Old Babylonian period, we encounter descriptions of kingship that perpetually emphasize the transmission of authority from the gods through chosen intermediaries, with early rulers of Kish, Uruk, and Ur described as possessing lifespans extending far beyond normal human parameters, some reigning for multiple centuries, others for thousands of years, figures that the conventional scholarly response dismisses as mythological exaggeration, but which contemporary analysis of the astronomical and mathematical knowledge embedded within these texts suggests may reflect actual chronological records expressed through a different conceptual framework than the Gregorian calendar, or even the Julian astronomical year, perhaps employing extended chronological units based on cycles of Jupiter, Saturn, or more complex astronomical calculations that modern scholarship has not yet successfully reverse-engineered from the available evidence. The ruler Emabaragesi of Kish appears in the king list as the first ruler to explicitly claim military dominion over neighboring city-states, and his inscriptions date to approximately 2600 BCE. Yet the texts describing his authority contain repeated references to his having received confirmation of his right to rule from the Anunnaki directly, from Enlil, who was consistently identified in Sumerian religious texts as the executive administrator of the divine will, the being who issued commands to the assembled gods and ensured compliance with decisions made in the divine assembly that convened in the location called the Nippur Temple Complex, a site that archaeological excavation has confirmed was indeed the religious center of Mesopotamia throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian periods, the geographical focal point from which religious authority radiated throughout the civilization. Documentary evidence preserved on clay tablets from the reign of Shulgi of Ur, who ruled approximately 2094 to 2047 BCE, depicts this king describing himself as the adopted son of Enlil, explicitly stating that he had been chosen by the divine assembly to administer human affairs on their behalf. And the inscriptions further describe Shulgi undertaking astronomical observations and calculations that determined the alignment of temple construction, the timing of religious festivals, and the coordination of military campaigns with specific celestial alignments, suggesting not merely a correlation between divine will and human action, but an explicitly integrated system wherein the divine determination of timing and the human execution of action proceeded in conscious coordination, with the human ruler functioning as a conscious agent, implementing a predetermined plan, rather than making autonomous decisions based on human judgment and circumstance. And the surviving temple records from Ur describe elaborate astronomical instruments housed within the temple's inner sanctum. Instruments that archaeological excavation has confirmed once existed in those locations, though the instruments themselves have long since vanished from the archaeological record, removed and destroyed rather than abandoned in place, as would have occurred if they had merely fallen into disuse over time. The cuneiform records of the dynasty of Agad, particularly those inscriptions left by Sargon of Akkad, who unified Mesopotamia around 2334 BCE, contain descriptions of military campaigns coordinated with celestial events, specific references to the positioning of Venus in conjunction with Sirius at the moment when Sargon's armies would breach the walls of particular cities. References so astronomically specific that they could be calculated and verified against actual historical dates. And when such calculations are performed, the dates align with remarkable precision, suggesting either that Sargon possessed astronomical knowledge of extraordinary sophistication, or that the records represent accounts written by observers possessing such knowledge and employed by Sargon to coordinate human actions with celestial phenomena in a manner that would appear miraculous or divinely ordained to the general population. Within the religious texts of Mesopotamia, there exists a consistent motif regarding the Anunnaki's response to human technological development. Specifically the notion that whenever humanity approached certain technological thresholds or demographic milestones, the gods would intervene either to accelerate human progress toward particular goals or to impose restrictions, preventing advance in directions deemed contrary to divine interests. And this pattern appears with sufficient consistency across texts separated by centuries of composition that it cannot be attributed to coincidental repetition, but rather suggests a fundamental understanding within Mesopotamian culture that technological development was not a natural human process, but rather occurred within parameters established and maintained by external forces, divine forces that both enabled and constrained human advancement, according to criteria that the texts suggest served the interests of the Anunnaki themselves. The evidence suggesting that human civilization was deliberately engineered to serve as a subordinate system producing resources and labor for the benefit of the divine, rather than developing autonomously toward its own purposes. The Babylonian priest and historian Berosus, who compiled historical and mythological records during the reign of Antiochus I in the 3rd century BCE, recorded in his work Babyloniaca accounts derived from much older temple archives and priestly traditions, describing a period when the Anunnaki openly ruled Mesopotamian civilization through their designated representatives. And Berosus further recorded traditions describing an anticipated return of the Anunnaki, a future period when these beings would once more make their presence manifest and resume direct governance of human affairs, returning to establish new forms of organizational control and to extract from humanity the resources and services that the texts suggest had been the underlying purpose of human creation all along. The archaeological record demonstrates that around 2000 BCE, at the conclusion of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, Mesopotamian civilization underwent a dramatic collapse, a period designated by scholars as the end of the Ur III period, characterized by the abandonment of major cities, the cessation of temple construction, the breakdown of trade networks that had connected the various city-states, and the fragmentary nature of written records, suggesting either a catastrophic loss of literacy or a deliberate suppression of record-keeping practices that had defined Mesopotamian culture for approximately 1500 years. And the conventional explanations offered by archaeological scholarship attribute this collapse to invasion by external populations, specifically the Amorite peoples from Syria and the Arabian Peninsula. Yet the archaeological evidence does not support widespread military destruction, the excavations at Ur itself revealing no layers of ash or burned rubble or scattered weapons characteristic of military siege and conquest. instead revealing orderly abandonment with remaining goods carefully stored, suggesting planned departure rather than chaotic flight, with temple treasures removed and hidden in buried caches rather than looted by invaders, suggesting not conquest by external enemies, but rather withdrawal by the population in response to some condition that the surviving records do not explicitly describe, but which contemporary scholars, working with the available evidence, suggest may have been environmental catastrophe, geological disturbance, or deliberately imposed crisis by the political authorities themselves as a mechanism of social control. The documents from the period immediately preceding the collapse, specifically the administrative records from the reign of Ibbi Sin, who ruled during the period approximately 20034 to 20026 BCE, contain references to widespread crop failures, to the breakdown of food distribution systems, to messages of distress sent by provincial governors unable to provide tribute to the central authority. And yet, these records also contain references to astronomical phenomena, to warnings issued by temple astronomers regarding celestial configurations deemed inauspicious, to the interpretation of astronomical signs as omens suggesting divine displeasure and the approaching withdrawal of divine favor from the Mesopotamian civilization. Documents that suggest the administration was explicitly aware that a transition point was approaching, that the period of close divine involvement in Mesopotamian affairs was about to terminate, and that the withdrawal of divine support and oversight would be followed by conditions of disorder, suffering, and the fragmentation of the unified political systems that had characterized Mesopotamian civilization. The historical period following the collapse of Ur-3, designated by scholars as the Old Babylonian period, witnessed the re-emergence of organized civilization, but under fundamentally altered circumstances, with religious authority no longer centralized in a single temple complex, but distributed among multiple city-states, each maintaining its own priestly hierarchy and its own interpretation of divine will, each claiming that its particular gods had granted its rulers special authority and divine mandate. And the inscriptions of old Babylonian kings consistently reference receiving information, commands, and authorizations through dreams, through messages delivered by priests who claim to have been visited by divine beings, through the interpretation of omens in animal entrails and celestial phenomena, suggesting that direct, clear communication between the divine and human leadership had been replaced by mediated communication, requiring interpretation by specially trained priests, communication that was necessarily ambiguous and subject to varying interpretations depending on the interests and biases of those performing the interpretation, creating an information environment where the will of the gods could never be directly verified, but only asserted by priests claiming to possess exclusive access to divine communication. The Code of Hammurabi, promulgated by the Babylonian king during his reign around 1792 BCE, was explicitly framed as divinely authorized law code, the preamble describing how Marduk had chosen Hammurabi to establish righteous governance and had granted him the authority to implement laws derived from divine wisdom. And the inscribed stele depicting this code shows Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Marduk. Yet the laws themselves contain no references to direct divine enforcement or to supernatural punishment for violations, instead establishing systems of human enforcement through appointed officials, suggesting a transition in the mode of governance from systems wherein the gods directly ensured compliance through supernatural means, to systems wherein the gods granted authority to human rulers, who then employed human enforcement mechanisms, a delegation of authority that effectively placed enforcement power in the hands of human administrators who could interpret and manipulate divine will according to circumstances beneficial to their own interests. Following the period of the Old Babylonian civilization and continuing through the subsequent periods of Kassite rule, the Hittite cultural sphere, the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and the Neo-Babylonian period, A consistent pattern emerges in which religious authority becomes increasingly concentrated in priestly hands and increasingly distant from the general population, with temple architecture evolving to include restricted access zones, wherein only designated priests could enter and commune with the gods, with religious knowledge becoming increasingly specialized and esoteric, recorded in languages that required years of training to master, written on tablets that were systematically destroyed or hidden away from public view, creating an information asymmetry wherein the priesthood alone possessed knowledge of what the gods supposedly wanted and how the gods communicated their will. And this asymmetry enabled the priesthood to exercise enormous political and economic power without being subject to verification or contradiction by the general population. A situation that persists through the entire period of Mesopotamian civilization, from approximately 2000 BCE through the conquest by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, a period spanning approximately 1700 years, during which the promised return of the Anunnaki did not occur, during which the civilization that had once possessed direct contact with these beings gradually developed the belief that such contact had been possible only in ancient times and was no longer available in the present, gradually accepted the notion that the gods communicated primarily through dreams and omens, rather than through direct manifestation and speech, gradually lost the technological sophistication that had characterized the earlier periods of Mesopotamian civilization. The decline of Mesopotamian technological capability is evident in numerous domains of human knowledge and practice that were preserved through the periods of ancient civilization, but were progressively lost and forgotten as the classical period transitioned into the medieval period. During the height of Sumerian civilization, approximately 2600 to 2300 BCE, mathematics had advanced to such sophistication that cuneiform tablets describe calculations of square roots, cubic roots, and complex geometric relationships, suggesting knowledge of algebra and geometry far exceeding what would be independently developed by isolated human populations. And yet, by the time of classical Greek civilization, approximately 500 years into the Common Era, mathematics had regressed significantly, with Greek mathematicians treating as revolutionary discoveries principles that Mesopotamian mathematicians had documented over 3,000 years previously, suggesting not continuous development of knowledge, but rather loss and rediscovery, a cyclical pattern in which knowledge achieved during periods of advanced civilization was lost during periods of collapse, only to be painfully relearned centuries later. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Mesopotamian temple records includes calculations of planetary movements, orbital periods, and eclipse predictions of such precision that modern scholars working backward from these calculations have been forced to conclude that the ancients must have possessed either extremely sophisticated mathematical models or the capability to make direct astronomical observations spanning centuries. Data collection processes that would require not merely individual observers, but organized institutional systems of data accumulation and preservation. Systems that would require writing, record-keeping, and the organizational complexity characteristic of advanced civilizations. And yet, the conventional narrative suggests that such organizational complexity and writing did not develop spontaneously among Mesopotamian populations, but rather appeared suddenly around 3000 BCE in the archaeological record, appearing fully formed without discernible developmental stages, appearing with such sophistication that immediate implementation of complex administrative systems became possible, suggesting that writing and the organizational technologies associated with it were introduced by external agents, rather than developed through gradual human experimentation and discovery. The specific aspect of Mesopotamian knowledge that deserves extended examination in considering the question of the Anunnaki's anticipated return is the domain of medical knowledge. The records preserved on clay tablets from various periods describing procedures, medications, and diagnostic techniques that suggest sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology. Understanding that would have required either direct instruction by entities possessing such knowledge or permission to systematically dissect human bodies and conduct experiments on living human subjects, practices that were generally prohibited in ancient Mesopotamian society according to religious law and cultural tradition. And yet the precision with which anatomical procedures were described in medical texts suggests observational knowledge that could not have been obtained through theoretical reasoning alone, but must have derived from direct observation and experimentation, suggesting either that exceptions to religious prohibitions existed within temple contexts where trained medical personnel could conduct anatomical investigations, or that direct instruction from external sources provided the anatomical knowledge without requiring direct experimentation. The tablet designated as BAM 166 in the archaeological record, a Babylonian medical text preserved in the British Museum and translated by Franz Kocher in 1963, describes surgical procedures for treating various conditions, including the opening of the brain case to address neurological trauma, the careful suturing of internal injuries to blood vessels, the application of specific plant materials as antiseptics and fever-reducing agents, procedures and medications that would remain unknown in formal medical practice in European civilization until the Renaissance period, approximately 2,000 years later, suggesting that the knowledge did not persist through the classical and medieval periods, but was lost when Mesopotamian civilization declined and replaced by significantly less sophisticated medical practice in subsequent civilizations. Knowledge that had to be painfully rediscovered through gradual experimentation, rather than being continuously transmitted as a body of preserved tradition. Within the religious context of Mesopotamian civilization, the role of the priesthood underwent profound transformation across the centuries, with early priests described as individuals who had direct contact with the Anunnaki, who received explicit instructions regarding temple construction and maintenance, who were granted access to chambers within temples wherein the presence of the gods was directly experienced, described in one text as experiencing the overwhelming brilliance of divine presence, suggesting exposure to light sources of extraordinary intensity. And yet, by the later periods of Mesopotamian civilization, the priesthood's role had transformed into one of interpreting dreams, observing omens, and conducting